Okay, so you guys sent over a bunch of articles all about this HMPV thing. Yeah, it's been really making headlines, especially over in China. And you want the need to know, right? You want us to break it all down without getting, too lost in the weeds. Well, you came to the right place because in this deep dive, we're going deep into the world of HMPV.
And it's really interesting that all of the articles that you sent are from Indian news outlets.
hmm
And it kind of gives us this outside perspective on how China is responding to all this.
Okay, so first things first, what exactly is this HMPV? It sounds kind of scary, especially with all this talk of new virus and everything.
Yeah, so let's clear the air right away. HMPV is not a new virus. It's a respiratory virus. It's kind of like a
Yeah.
really nasty cold or flu. And it was officially discovered back in 2001, but research shows that it's been circulating for at least like 60 years.
60 years. Wow, that's longer than I've been alive. And here I was thinking this was some like brand new superbug or something. But okay, so here's where it gets even more interesting. Most people actually catch HMPV by the time they turn 5 years old.
Exactly. And you might be thinking, well, if I probably already had it, what's the big deal? The thing is, like with a lot of viruses, that first infection can really knock you down, especially for little kids whose immune systems, are still developing.
So, okay, symptom-wise, what are we talking about here? I was reading one of the articles and it mentioned cough, fever, stuffy nose, the usual suspects when you're feeling under the weather. But then it also mentioned shortness of breath, and that doesn't sound like your average sniffles anymore.
Right. You're right. And that's where it can take a turn for the worse. So those are the typical symptoms.
Yeah.
But HMPV can escalate, particularly for vulnerable groups. So we're talking about young children, the elderly, or anyone with a weakened immune system. And it can actually lead to more serious complications like bronchitis or pneumonia. And in some cases, it can even trigger asthma flare-ups.
And that seems to be what's happening over in China right now, right? I mean, some of these articles paint a pretty intense picture. Surge in cases, hospitals packed to the brim, and social media is just buzzing with all these posts about long wait times and multiple viruses going around. It kind of feels like we're going back to like the early days of COVID.
There's definitely an uptick in cases,
hmm
particularly among children under 14. And yeah, hospitals are facing increased pressure. But it is crucial to note that unlike with COVID, no official emergency has been declared.
So are Chinese officials like downplaying the situation then? I noticed
Yeah.
that some of these articles actually quote Chinese officials, and they're saying things like, this year's respiratory illnesses are less severe and smaller in scale compared to last year. Are they just trying to like avoid a panic or something?
Well, it's certainly possible that they're trying to manage public perception, especially after everything that happened with COVID.
Yeah.
But there's also some evidence that they've learned from the past, and they're taking a more proactive approach this time around. They've actually implemented a new monitoring system specifically designed to keep tabs on pneumonia cases of unknown origin.
Interesting. So instead of just waiting for things to spiral out of control, they're trying to get ahead of the curve and identify potential threats early on, which makes sense, especially after, everything that happened with COVID. But is that the main reason there's so much concern around HMPV right now? I mean, are we just like extra sensitive to any new virus that pops up because of what happened with the pandemic?
I think that's definitely part of it, yeah. I mean, we're all a bit more attuned to potential health threats now. But there's also this theory of a post-COVID catch-up happening. So basically, after years of lockdowns, masks, and social distancing, our immune systems might be a bit rusty.
Oh, so it's like our immune systems all went on vacation and now they're back at work with a huge backlog to deal with.
That's a great way to put it, yeah. Plus, remember that HMPV is seasonal. It usually peaks during the winter and spring months. So we've got a few factors converging here. Potentially weakened population immunity, the usual seasonal spike in respiratory illnesses, and then don't forget this heightened awareness thanks to our recent global pandemic experience.
Okay, so we've got this perfect storm brewing, and it's making everyone a bit nervous. So let's get to the big question. What can we actually do about it? Is there like a magic bullet cure for HMPV?
Unfortunately, no, there's no quick fix. There isn't a specific antiviral treatment or vaccine available for HMPV yet.
Yet being the operative word there. But I'm guessing there are still things that people can do to protect themselves, right? I mean, I've seen those public service announcements a million times. Wash your hands, cover your coughs, stay home when you're sick. Surely all that still applies here.
Absolutely, you'll notice that same theme running through all of your sources, those basic hygiene practices. They might seem simple, even a bit old-fashioned, but they remain our most effective weapons against the spread of respiratory viruses, including HMPV.
So while we wait for science to catch up and give us that magic bullet, it's back to basics for now. Good old-fashioned prevention is key. especially when we're dealing with a virus that doesn't have a specific cure. So to recap what we've learned so far, HMPV itself isn't new, but this recent surge in cases, especially in China, is definitely something to keep an eye on.
Exactly. And while there's no need to panic, this situation raises some interesting questions. How we as a global community approach emerging health threats. What have we learned from COVID? Are we truly better prepared to handle a new pandemic-level event?
Those are some big questions, and I have a feeling we'll be unpacking them in more detail as we continue this deep dive. Stay tuned.
Welcome back. Before we move on, I just wanted to touch on something that we briefly mentioned earlier, which is China's new monitoring system for pneumonia cases. One of your sources actually calls it a pilot system, which honestly sounds a little experimental, don't you think?
Yeah, pilot system does make it sound like they're still kind of figuring things out as they go. I mean, should that be a cause for concern? Like, are they really ready to handle a major outbreak if they're still testing the waters?
That's a fair question. But remember, HMPV was only discovered in 2001. We're all still learning about this virus, even the experts. So in a way, any approach to monitoring and managing it is going to have elements of experimentation. The important thing is that they're actively trying to improve their surveillance and response capabilities.
So it's a work in progress, but at least they're working on it. Speaking of learning as we go, one article mentioned that HMPV typically peaks in winter and spring. So is this current surge just the seasonal thing then? Are we just making a mountain out of a molehill?
It's probably not that simple. It's more likely a combination of factors at play. You've got the seasonal aspect, the post-COVID catch-up that we talked about. And don't forget about all those social media reports about multiple viruses circulating at the same time. It's not just HMPV that's causing trouble.
Right. Some of those social media posts were pretty wild. They were talking about influenza, a mycoplasma pneumonia, even COVID making a bit of a comeback. It's like a whole respiratory virus party going on over there.
Yeah, and it's important to remember that social media isn't always the most reliable source of information. It can give us a glimpse into what people are experiencing on the ground. But it's also crucial to look at the official data.
Okay, so what does the official data tell us then? What's the real story?
Well, according to the Chinese Center for Disease Control and Prevention, influenza is actually the leading cause of respiratory illness right now. In the last week of 2024, over 30% of respiratory illness tests came back positive for influenza, compared to about 6% for HMPV.
So influenza is the bigger threat at the moment. But then why is everyone making such a big deal about HMPV? Is it just media hype? Or is there something else going on?
I think there are a few reasons why HMPV is getting so much attention. First, there's the novelty factor. It's a relatively new virus, and we're still learning about its long-term effects and how to treat it effectively. Second, the lack of a specific treatment or vaccine creates a sense of vulnerability. People feel like they have fewer options when it comes to protecting themselves and their loved ones. And third, let's be honest, the media tends to gravitate towards what's new and potentially alarming. It's a more compelling story, even if it doesn't always reflect the full picture.
That makes sense. But speaking of media coverage, I have to ask about those headlines. You know, the ones that are all like, China's new virus outbreak? Were they just blowing things out of proportion, or was there actually some truth to all the panic?
It's not entirely hype. There's definitely a real increase in HMPV cases, especially among children. But the situation isn't as dire as some headlines suggest. Remember, no official emergency has been declared. And China is actively taking steps to monitor and manage the situation, even if their approach is still evolving.
So it's more nuanced than those attention-grabbing headlines would have us believe. Okay, so we've talked a lot about China's response, but one of our sources, this Indian news outlet, they mentioned that their National Center for Disease Control is also keeping a close eye on things.
That's a great point. And it highlights the importance of global cooperation when it comes to infectious diseases. India is essentially learning from China's experience, and they're taking precautions to try to prevent a similar surge in cases within their own borders.
So what does that look like in practice? Are they doing anything differently than China?
Well, India's approach seems to be focused on raising awareness and emphasizing preventative measures. One official was actually quoted as saying, "One thing I would like to convey to the public is to take general precautions that we use against all respiratory infections." Sound familiar?
Wash your hands, cover your coughs, the classics. But this time it's not just a friendly reminder, it's like a key part of their strategy.
Exactly. With no specific antiviral or vaccine available, these simple measures become even more crucial. It's about empowering individuals to take control of their own health and contribute to the collective well-being.
So we've covered a lot of ground here. We've learned what HMPV is, how it spreads the symptoms to watch out for, and what's happening in both China and India. If our listener had to walk away with just one key takeaway, what would it be?
I think the most important message is this. HMPV is a real concern, especially for vulnerable populations. But it's not a cause for panic. We have the knowledge and the tools to protect ourselves and each other.
It's like we've leveled up in our understanding of respiratory viruses after going through the COVID pandemic. We're not starting from scratch anymore. We know what to do. And we're better equipped to handle these kinds of challenges.
Precisely. We've learned valuable lessons about prevention, the importance of global collaboration, and the need for accurate and timely information. And hopefully that yet about a vaccine or treatment won't be hanging in the air for too long.
Fingers crossed on that one. But before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, there's one more thing I wanted to touch on. One of the articles quoted a Chinese foreign ministry spokesperson, and they were basically downplaying the severity of the situation, saying that respiratory infections are common in the winter, and that this year's cases are less severe and smaller in scale than last year.
Right, we talked about that earlier. It's understandable that they want to manage public perception, especially given their history with COVID. But I think this statement raises a broader question. If respiratory infections are just a seasonal expectation, and we're already seeing this kind of strain on healthcare systems with HMPV and influenza, what happens if a truly novel and dangerous virus emerges? Are we truly prepared for another pandemic-level event?
That's a chilling thought, and honestly a bit unsettling. Are we just constantly going to be playing catch-up with these viruses?
That's a question for each of us to consider, both individually and as a global community. But that's a deep dive for another day.
You've given us a lot to think about. We'll be back with part 3 to wrap up our HMPV discussion and hopefully find some answers to those big questions. Don't go anywhere. Okay, so we're back for the final part of our HMPV deep dive. You know, before we went to the break, we were talking about whether or not we're really prepared for another pandemic. And it's a pretty heavy question to end on, so I'm hoping we can maybe shed a little more light on it now.
Yeah, it's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And while your sources don't offer any, easy answers, I do think there are some clues that we can find in how the world is reacting to this HMPV situation. It's like we're getting a little glimpse into the future of pandemic preparedness.
Okay, so let's play detective then. What kind of clues are we seeing?
One article mentioned that China is insisting that they were completely transparent with the sharing of information about COVID-19. But then, right after that, it talks about how the World Health Organization is basically saying, hold on, we need more data to really understand what's going on.
So there's a bit of tension there. It sounds like everyone's still trying to figure out, who's responsible for what when a new virus pops up.
Exactly. And remember all those social media posts we discussed? Lots of chatter, some of it accurate, some of it not. It just highlights how difficult it is to get reliable information out to the public quickly during an outbreak.
Especially when things are changing so fast. I mean, one day it's all new virus panic, and the next it's, oh, actually, it's not that bad. It's hard to know what to believe.
Right. And that's where I think the lessons we've learned from COVID come in. Multiple sources emphasize China's new monitoring system for pneumonia of unknown origin. It's a clear attempt to be more proactive this time, to detect potential threats before they become full-blown crises.
So instead of waiting for things to blow up, they're trying to put out the fire before it even starts. I mean, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Right?
It does. And I think it speaks to a larger shift in how we think about global health. Yeah, the pandemic really drove home the point that infectious diseases don't care about borders. What happens in one corner of the world can quickly impact everyone everywhere.
Yeah, we're all connected whether we like it or not. So where do we go from here? Are we just doomed to repeat, the chaos of COVID every time a new virus pops up?
That's the big question. And unfortunately, I don't have a crystal ball. But I do think these sources offer a glimmer of hope. The fact that countries like India are watching what's happening in China and taking proactive steps to prepare themselves, that's progress.
It's like instead of competing with each other, we're finally realizing that we're all on the same team when it comes to these viruses. We have to work together if we want to win.
Exactly. And remember, while we don't have a specific treatment or vaccine for HMPV yet, research is ongoing. Scientists around the world are working hard to develop new tools to combat this virus.
There's that yet again. It's like a little beacon of hope in all of this. Okay, so what does all this mean for our listener? The one who's been patiently absorbing all this HMPV information. What's the big takeaway?
I think the biggest takeaway is empowerment. Knowledge is power. And understanding the dynamics of HMPV, how it spreads, what the symptoms are, the potential risks, It equips you to make informed choices for your own health and the health of those around you.
Right, we're not just helpless bystanders here. We can take those preventive measures, stay informed, and even advocate for better global health security. We have a role to play in this.
Absolutely. And on that note, I want to leave our listener with one final thought. We've talked a lot about prevention, but what about early detection? If you or someone you know starts experiencing those HMPV symptoms, don't hesitate to seek medical advice. Early intervention can make a world of difference.
That's a great point. Sometimes we try to tough it out, but when it comes to respiratory illnesses, it's always better to err on the side of caution.
Well, I think it's safe to say we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. From the initial what is HMPV all the way to the bigger picture of global health security. It's been quite a journey.
It has. And hopefully, our listener feels a little more informed and a little more prepared to navigate this complex world of infectious diseases.
That's what we aim for here at the Deep Dive. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and most importantly, stay healthy.